How about now? Can you hear me now? Yeah. Ah, very good. Okay. As I was saying, I speak on this globally. I've been speaking since about 2009. How I got involved was Richie Phillips was taken hostage, and I was actually home at the time. I had just come off a trip, and I was listening to Howie Carr. And as Howie Carr was on the radio, they were all talking. It was make him walk the gangplank, yeah, 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 give him rum and all this kind of stuff. And it was the Walt Disney type stuff about pirates, when I could actually see that nobody really understood the importance of what was going on and how terrible this problem has been for many, many years. And they were making light of the subject. So I got on the phone and I called Howie Carr, and I got on the station and talked with Howie for quite a while about piracy and the dilemma we've been facing, because this is something I've been dealing with my whole career going to sea. After I had hung up with Howie Carr, Howie's radio station had called me back up and said, would you be glad to come back on the radio station tomorrow and talk about it a little bit more? So I did. And he had a call in where people were asking me questions and this and that. Then what happened was the Maritime Academy called me and asked me if I would come down and represent the Maritime Academy and Captain Richie Phillips, because Richie was a classmate of mine and also a very good friend. So, like I said, this piracy issue really touched me very closely, because number one, I had a friend that was being held hostage by Somali pirates, and I knew quite a bit about Somali pirates. So I got involved with that, and from there I started talking on CNN and Fox News, and I hit all the radio shows and all the TV shows for about a week. I was everywhere. I was, TV worldwide. I had people calling me from Singapore telling me they saw me on BBC, and so I had gotten out there and I had started speaking on piracy, not knowing that this is where my career would start leading to. So I retired in 2010 and I started up my own business, which is a maritime consulting company, mostly on safety. I did a lot of consulting when the Costa Concordia went down, when she had an accident. I was on CNN for about a week every single day on Anderson Cooper and Soledad O'Brien. She had me on every single morning. So I was a consultant for CNN, and I still am, on all their maritime affairs. So that's where my career has led to. And in 2011, I was called back by the Navy to become a contracting officer for them, to get involved with what they call the LMSR program. And I'll talk a little bit about that. But it's a program that we have active ships that are just sitting worldwide and in the country that are ready to go to war at any time. The ship I'm on right now is about 950 feet long. She can do 25 knots, and she can be up and ready to go in 96 hours with a full crew and moving. So what we'll do is we'll start taking a look at some of these slides, these things. I always like to use pictures because it helps explain the real problem. You get a good visual idea of what's going on. We'll have questions at the end, or if anybody has a question while I'm speaking, just raise your hand and I'll get to the question. So again, a little bit about my background is I'm a local kid. I'm from the South Shore. I went to Mass Maritime. I graduated from there, and I joined a union called the Master Mates and Pilots, which is a union of maritime officers, deck officers. And from there, I started out as a young third officer and worked my way all the way up to captain. I went to sea for 33 years, and 17 of those years I was a commercial captain. From there, I started my own company, which is called Ocean River, and that's my maritime consulting company. And this was the last ship that I was on commercially. What that ship there is, she's what they call a roll-on, roll-off ship, and she has a big ramp that she can lay down, and they load vehicles, they load cars, they load trucks, helicopters. We used to take quite a bit of military equipment on board these ships. Worldwide. This ship transited we'd leave the port of Boston and go worldwide eastbound and come back to the port of Boston in about 90 to 100 days. I'm also an instructor at an institute called MITAGS, which is the Maritime Institute of Technical Graduates and Studies, which is a professional school where maritime officers go to upgrade their licenses and to keep furthering and continuing education to stay competent in the field. As this field is evolving all the time, with all the new gadgets. When I started sailing back in the 70s, all we had was Loran A. It went to Loran C. Now both Loran A and Loran C are gone. We've gone into satellite navigation. Now we're just into GPS type navigation. But when I started, we were using all the old school stuff with the terrestrial, using lighthouses and buoys and all the good stuff with the sextant. That's kind of going by the wayside these days as the electronics are starting to come into it. So I teach down there. I just got done actually teaching a 2-week celestial navigation class plus a vessel security officer class down there. The ship that I'm on right now, that I'll be actually supposedly going back to tomorrow, is called the USNS Shugart. And that vessel was named for Randy Shugart, who was a Delta Team guy that was one of the Delta Team officers that was in one of the Blackhawks when they went down in Somalia that they made the movie on. Randy Shugart was one of the guys that came back and actually went into the helicopter along with his compadre, Gordon. They protected the helicopters until their demise. He was later awarded the Medal of Honor. So I am now in command of his vessel, which I just actually took out during Hurricane Isaac. I had to take the ship out of New Orleans to hurricane evacuate. So what I'm going to talk about today, and here we are, this is the Shugart right here, you can see her. Again, Randy Shugart, is quite a hero. But what we're going to talk about today is piracy and the perception of piracy. And when you talk about piracy, especially like when I said I was talking with Howie Carr, you know, the perception was the Walt Disney pirates, you know, the Pirates of the Caribbean. Billy the Captain Kidd and his buried treasure. So everybody had that kind of concept of what a pirate was. It was, you know, the Jack Sparrows that were out there today. And that's really not the concept. That's really not the way it is in the real world. And as we can see, Jack Sparrow, he's the hero. He was the hero. He's been a hero for the last 3 movies. And this is what everybody thought pirates were all about. I mean, how could you not love this guy, right? So when we talk about piracy, we've got to understand a little bit about the history of piracy. And piracy goes all the way back to the days of civilization, to when we started. There's been pirates out there since day one. Caesar was taken by pirates. St. Patrick was taken by pirates. But during the golden age, in the 1650 to 1730, we can see where all the pirates were. This was their haven down in this whole area. There was pirates everywhere back in those days. And of course, we have some of the famous pirates that everybody's pretty familiar with. Blackbeard. Blackbeard's a legend. He's been a legend for a long time. They just found his ship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, that they're starting to now excavate on the ocean floor. They're starting to bring up stuff from his last vessel. One of the things about Blackbeard that he was famous for is he used to put the fuses for the cannons in his hair and light them on fire. So when he'd come walking, he'd have all this stuff sparkling, and he used to really horrify people, and they were quite afraid of him. So he was quite a legend. Then, of course, we have Captain Henry Morgan, who was another pirate, another famous pirate, and a brutal one. But yet we have them on the Captain Morgan spiced rum. So when we think of these pirates, we think of them in a light fare, in a good-natured way, that they were good guys. When actually these guys really were not good guys. These guys were ruthless. Bartholomew Roberts, known as Black Bart, he was probably one of the pirates that had probably the best luck at pirating. This guy was very wealthy, very rich, and well known in his day. But again, another ruthless man. And of course, my favorite pirate was Calico Jack. And Calico Jack is the one that famed the pirate flag. He is the one that designed it and used to fly it. So when we see the skull and crossbones, it was from Calico Jack. He is the one that made that flag famous. But one thing about Calico Jack was he was way ahead of his time, because he did allow women to be part of his crew. And 2 of the women that he allowed was Mary Read and Anne Bonny, who were very famous pirates, and probably some of the most bloodthirsty pirates that were ever out there. These 2 women, they killed quite a few people. They were finally captured and sent to prison, but eventually they were released because they were both pregnant. Now, when we talk about history repeating itself, it was so true during the Richie Phillips engagement of what happened. Because most people don't understand, if they're not from the military, they don't understand how vessels are named. And as we can see, most vessels are named after very famous people. You know, all our aircraft carriers are named after famous people, destroyers are, merchant vessels are. And the interesting thing about the Richie Phillips situation was it involved a frigate called the Bainbridge. And the Bainbridge and the Boxer were the 2 of the vessels that came to Richie Phillips' rescue. And the Bainbridge was first on scene with Captain Castellano. And when the Bainbridge arrived, she was shadowing the lifeboat that Captain Phillips was in. And I'll talk about that a little bit down here, but we're going to talk about Captain Bainbridge right now. Captain Bainbridge was very famous because he was one of the officers that used to have to go over and pay the days their allotment as for when we used to travel to transit the Barbary Coast. We no longer had England to protect our vessels anymore, so now as a nation we had to protect our own ships, or we had to pay booty, pay ransom. And we were paying ransom for quite a while. And Bainbridge was one of these officers that used to go over there and deliver the ransom to the days so that they would not take any of our ships and hold them hostage. And Bainbridge hated that. John Adams was very unpopular in his decision about what he wanted to do with the piracy. At the time, Jefferson was starting to build up a Navy fleet, and this is where the Navy really started. And the mission of the United States Navy at that time was to keep the oceans free. John Adams felt that we should continue to pay the ransom, because if we don't pay the ransom, we'll be fighting these pirates for the rest of our lives. So he's actually, in what he was saying back then, is actually true, because we still are fighting these pirates. So what Jefferson did was he had six ships built to go fight the Barbary Coast. We had the Chesapeake, which was 44 guns, the United States, which was 44 guns, the beloved Constitution in Boston, which was 44 guns. We had the Constellation, which is in Baltimore, the USS President, and the USS Congress. These ships were specifically built to go fight the Barbary Coast Wars. The only two ships that remain today are the Constitution and the Constellation. The Constitution being the oldest Navy vessel right now under the flag. And the famous saying back then was millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute. And that was from President Johnson. And that's when he sent the Philadelphia over to fight the Barbary Coast pirates. Bainbridge was part of that. He was on the Philadelphia. And what happened was he had been encountered by one of the dhows that had come out of Libya. And so he chased them. And when he chased them in, he ran the vessel aground at low water. And what he didn't realize was that it was low water and the tide would come up and he'd be able to fight. But on the sailing vessel at that time, they couldn't back her off the reef to use the cannon, so he surrendered. He surrendered the vessel, he surrendered the crew, and they became prisoners of the Barbary Coast pirates. This was Captain Bainbridge. So what happened was Preble went in and they blew the Philadelphia up. They blew it up because they did not want to leave it for any of the pirates. So they blew it up at that time. And as you can see, Lord Nelson thought that was one of the most bold and daring acts ever done in naval warfare at that time, is when they went into Tripoli and blew it up. Now the interesting thing about Mr. Neville O'Banion, Presley Neville O'Banion, who's from Virginia, was he was in the Marine Corps. And the interesting thing about this is that he was the one that marched 500 miles across the Libyan desert with 100 donkeys and 500 Marines, and they went in and they set Bainbridge free. And from that escapade is where we got the theme from the Marine Corps hymn, From the Shores of Tripoli. That's where that was put in. But the interesting thing about it is, after he went and saved Bainbridge and everybody, he was presented the Damascus sword. And that is the sword that the Marines use today, that was presented to Lieutenant O'Banion. So there's a lot of history here when we start talking about piracy in that part of the world.
What about the crew? You rescued Bainbridge, right?
Well, he rescued the crew too. They were all set free. And it was a long, epic battle, and they talked back and forth. And the main quote that came out of it was, "It'll be your head or mine," and that's when the battle started. And Bainbridge was freed along with the crew. So we really didn't find much about piracy. We didn't hear about it much unless you went down to Walt Disney, or you read books when you were a kid, Treasure Island and the whole 9 yards. So we really didn't have a good understanding of the piracy when this all came about off of Somalia, because we're talking about almost the same area. Richie Phillips was taken in April, and he was transiting from Djibouti and going to Mogadishu with food aid. At that time, what was happening was that there was no actual intelligence reports coming from the government. What was being put out there was open resource information to all ship captains that you had to stay at least 50 miles off the coast. because the pirates would travel out 50 miles, and that's when they started taking the ships. I think Rich was out about 150 miles, and yet he was still taken. They boarded his vessel. These ships aren't that fast. They have low freeboard, and they boarded him. He didn't stop the ship. He actually sank their vessel, but he put the crew away into their little hideout where they were safe. But Richie had to stay on board on the bridge, and he was taken. So the interesting thing is that the vessel that came and rescued Richie Phillips was the Bainbridge. You know, there was a coincidence there when that happened. And, you know, like I tell everybody, I'm sure that Captain Bainbridge is smiling down when he saw that it was his vessel that came to the rescue of the first American who's ever been held by a pirate since the 1700s. And we've been in patrol ever since, the Navy, and that's why we have a presence in the Mediterranean, is because of the Barbary Coast Pirates. Now, what happened with Rich, I don't know, how many people here have read Rich's book? Okay, there's a couple here that read it. The movie's coming out on March 22nd, so you'll be able to see the movie. But what happened in this situation was that Richie was left on the bridge with the crew. Most of the crew got back to the safe haven. There was a couple guys that were up on the bridge, one of the other navigating officers. They got taken and held by the pirates. One of the pirates went down looking for the crew with one of the crew members who spoke Arabic. And there was a little confrontation back there, and the pirate was taken. And eventually what happened was a deal was made that they would give the pirates the rescue boat. And the pirates were going to get in the rescue boat and they were going to leave. Well, when they got down in the water, the rescue boat didn't start. So the pirates came back up, and that's when they got into the lifeboat. And Phillips was actually in the lifeboat showing them how to launch it so they could get away. And that's when the pirates reneged. Never trust a pirate. So the pirates reneged on their deal, and that's when they held him hostage and they took him off into the lifeboat. So now the vessel was set free with all the pirates gone, but yet this was an optimal thing to happen, because now you didn't have to worry about 23 hostages, you only had to worry about one as far as a military standpoint. Go ahead.
Let me ask, prior to April 2009 of the Maersk Alabama and Captain Phillips being taken over, didn't the pirates fear on the stern seeing the American flag versus other vessels? That
No.
was like the first.
Not at all. I'll talk about that in a little bit too. So what happened was they took 80 SEALs, came out of Dev Group, out of Norfolk. They loaded up in a plane, and they were on their way. They jumped out. They made a night jump, high level, what they call a halo jump out, high level altitude jump with boats, guns, and everything, landed in the water, and then they were picked up by the vessels. And from there, they set up the sniper teams. And what happened was, when you get inside an enclosed lifeboat like that, you got a very strong smell of fiberglass and diesel fuel. So it's very nauseous. You get very nauseous very easily. The first thing you ever do when you get in a lifeboat or a life raft is you take a seasickness pill. Doesn't matter how long you've been going to sea, and you may be the saltiest guy out there. You take a seasickness pill, because I guarantee you will get sick. And that's one of the reasons that these Somalis chew on what they call this drug called khat. And it's a drug that's like an amphetamine, and it keeps them going, and it helps curb the seasickness. So when they got 3 of these guys, these 4, there was actually 4 pirates that were in the boat with Richie. One of them had been stabbed and cut, so they put him off. The Navy SEALs were all around the lifeboat in the water at the time. They put the one pirate off, and they put him onto the Boxer, and they gave him medical attention. So now they only had to worry about 3 pirates. What happened was the pirates were getting quite sick. Because they were inside a capsulated boat. It was probably 125 degrees, 130 degrees in that boat. There's no bathrooms, there's no fresh water, so it's not a very nice place to be. It's a very hostile environment for any length of time, so it was very uncomfortable for them. So the SEALs knew that. They knew it was a matter of time before these guys were going to probably give it up and quit, but they weren't sure. So they were giving them food, they were trying to help them out a little bit, but at nighttime what they would do is they told them, because the lifeboat had run out of fuel and the weather was a little bit rough, so the boat was rocking quite a bit. So what they did was they told the pirates they would take them under tow and get some movement on the vessel, so that would stabilize their vessel a little bit. But when they did that, they made the tow line fast to the Bainbridge, But at nighttime, the SEALs would roll it in every little bit. They would bring them in 100 yards, at a time. So they brought them into a good shooting range so that they could get a good shot on these guys. So they rolled them all in until they got them really close. Now what happened was, when Phillips was inside the lifeboat, these pirates had been obviously playing mind games with him, and what they had been doing was putting a gun to his head and dry firing at least 100 times. So they would put the gun and pull the trigger, so he never knew what was going to happen. Now you got to remember, these pirates aren't trained militarily in weapons. They're not weapons expert. These are just kids that picked up guns since they were young, and they've been shooting, so they really don't know a lot about weapons. They're chewing cot. You don't know if they're high. So he didn't know if these guns were loaded or not. So they were doing this for quite a while. Richie tried to make one escape. They had the back door open in the lifeboat. He saw that one of the pirates was sleeping, and there was an AK-47 there beside him. And it was either grab the AK-47 or make a jump for it. And he positively did the right thing, because the last thing you want to do is get into a gunfight inside a small place with two other guys that got guns, and he didn't know anything about an AK-47. Richie was a non-gun type guy. Richie didn't like guns. He was a non-gun guy at that time. So he made a dive for the water, and Rich went into the ocean and tried to get out, and he tried to escape, because he figured the SEALs would be around him at the time, but they weren't. They were back on the Boxer. So as he was in the water, the Somalis were taking shots at him, and he came back. They got him back on board. So he had tried to escape one time, which showed that he was always thinking that he hadn't given up. And that's one of the, when you're in a hostage situation, you never really want to give up. So what happened was, after about another day or two of this dry firing, Richard got tired of it, and he said, enough's enough, and he started walking for the door again. And two of the Somalis had jumped on him to try to hold him down. Well, Richard's a pretty big guy. He's a pretty powerful guy, and these Somalis couldn't hold him down. So the other Somali fired a shot inside the lifeboat. And when he did that, they all immediately realized what they had just done. So they all stuck their heads up out of the hatches and said, he's okay, he's okay. And that's when the SEALs took the shots. So that's how they got him. So Rich had a little bit to do with that, but it had happened so fast that when one of them had fallen from the top hatch down, he landed beside Richie. Richie had thought they were shooting each other, and he didn't realize it. And he said by the time that the Somali had hit the seat, the SEALs were already inside the boat. They were right outside there. And then they got Rich, and they brought him back. So it was a very good ending to Rich's hostage situation.
Didn't his crew badmouth him after?
That's true. And
They said he was doing this to save 24 hours of sea time. He could have gone on
the crew did say that.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you, when you're sailing captain, it's you against the world. It's you that's up there. And there'll be people out there that, and I've heard them say things about Rich Phillips and his reputation and the whole 9 yards. I've sat with Rich many, many times and talked with him about the way he commands a vessel. I would never tell him how to command a vessel, but he does things very similar to how I do them. A couple of the people that he had in his crew, I can tell you stories about them. Two of them I had personally fired years ago and told the company never to hire them back. One of them was actually incompetent, and he's the one that's leading the charge for this lawsuit. So it's a very frivolous lawsuit, and how it all came about is another friend of mine, John Burnett, who wrote a book called Dangerous Waters. John was an author, and he was also in a pirate incident, like I said, written a book, Dangerous Waters. You can get it on Amazon. It's actually a pretty good book. John was going to write a book about the crew because he knew that somebody was writing a book about Rich Phillips. So when John sat the crew down and started talking to them and got their stories, he realized there was no story here. And so once there was no story, that's when the crew started saying, well, we'll sue. And that's when they started suing. So you've been seeing that for a long time. And like I said, they said that he had information that said to stay this far and that far. That was all open source stuff. It was never from the company. It was never from an intelligence. And the thing that when you're master, if you're told to stay 50 miles off the coast and you're 150 miles off the coast and you get taken, these are pirates. They can be anywhere out there. And at the time, I had been talking to people. And let me step this back just a little bit. Prior to Rich Phillips being taken, I was lecturing Office of Naval Intelligence. I do a lot of lecturing to the analysts, to a lot of analysts that belong to different organizations within the government. mostly on maritime operations and what we do on ships to bring them up so they understand what happens on a ship so they can do their part of their job. So I was actually working with some analysts that were part of the CIA and the DIA and O&I, and I was teaching a class on maritime operations. And at the end of the class, I was asked to talk a little bit about piracy. And this was like 4 weeks before the Alabama got taken. And the question that was asked to me, Captain, do you think that an American ship will be taken? And I said, absolutely. I said, an American ship will be taken. And the reason I said that was because I knew where the Alabama was operating. She was running from Djibouti to Mombasa the whole time. That's where she ran. She was off the Golden Horn the whole time. That's where she ran. And there's no way to go from Djibouti to Mombasa but one way. You know, you can't go via Singapore. You got to go around the Horn and go in. That's the only way you could do it. And without getting any good intelligence from the company or anybody else, it was his decision to go 150 miles off. People are saying he should have been 300 miles off. But what we don't know is there could have been somebody out there at 300 miles. You just don't know. Pirates are like the weather. You know, you can only maybe know where they'll be in 24 hours. Other than that, they could be anywhere. So when I was actually lecturing these people, and I told them it was a matter of time. It would be a matter of time before an American vessel got taken. Well, 4 weeks later, they went back to the Office of Naval Intelligence in D.C., and they had a symposium there where they invited top executives from the shipping companies in the United States, from the maritime companies, to come in and talk about piracy, because this was a problem that was starting to really develop. No American ships had been attacked at the time, although I had problems with them. They had been reported to certain people in the government, but nothing was being done. So they had the symposium in D.C., and one of the guys that was speaking said we had just taken a class at my tags, where I teach, and that a Captain Staples, had said that it was a matter of time before an American vessel got taken. Well, one of the senior vice presidents from a company stood up and said, Captain Staples is wrong. It will never happen to an American ship. It will never happen to a Maersk ship. A half an hour later, his phone was ringing. And my phone hasn't stopped ringing since. And I can't tell you, for a week long, I had nothing but black Fords with government plates in my driveway, sitting there wanting to talk to me about what was going on the coast of Somalia. So people were starting to listen. And I've been dealing with NCIS and O&I ever since. I've also told them a couple things about a couple other ships that I felt were going to be very vulnerable. And one of the ships I told them that they were going to get was a ship like the one I was on, that car carrier that you saw, that blue and white hulled ship. And they looked at me and they said, nah, that'll never happen. 6 weeks after I told them, one was taken. So, and that's the problem, is we've got people that are making decisions that aren't dealing in the real world. And they're not listening to their best assets, the guys that are out there doing it. And I see that in a lot of different things happening. But so that's how I got involved in it. And so Richie really only had one way to go. So that's what happened when he was taken. His crew, it's all frivolous. The chief engineer, Mike Perry, the one that he said was his hero, I can tell you right now he was arrested going through Kenya carrying a weapon because he was bringing a gun back to the ship and bringing ammunition. So he was fired from Maersk and let go. We don't want mariners carrying guns on ships. You're not allowed to. And when you have someone like that making decisions like that, then he should not be in command of an engine room. So, you know, the crew, what they're saying, it all comes down to the bottom line. It all comes down to money. You know, they're looking for money. That's what they want. Like I said, the guy leading the charge, John Cronin, he was worthless.
Why is that policy? Because prior to this upsurge, that was the thought that a lot of these merchant vessels are not armed. They're lucky they have one or two weapons
Right.
at most.
Right.
Why is that the policy?
Because the problem is we don't have the procedures on board to do background checks on people. I had a person on my ship, one of my 3 trips ago, that spent 17 years in Walpole. And this guy was a bad guy. And I didn't find out about that until he told me, because he had another incident. And my brother's a state trooper, and I had my brother run him. This is a guy that I would not want to pass a weapon out to.
But on the bridge of the wheelhouse, where there's a security place on the ship, I would think that, especially with the escalation.
Well, the first thing is that, you know, we're not trained military people. We're there to get a ship from A to B. That's our primary mission. There are other people that do certain things in life that it'd be better appropriate for doing something like that. The last thing I want to do as a captain taking it through a choke point is have to grab a gun and go defend the ship when I should be paying attention to getting that ship from A to B for traffic. So there's a lot of reasons why we don't want to get into that, and I could spend hours talking on that, but it's not a good idea because there's other things that can be done, and I'll talk about that too. So go ahead.
Are there any security procedures in place for the last 50 miles to get to Mogadishu?
Are there any what?
Security procedures?
At that time, there really weren't that many, there wasn't any security procedures set in place for piracy. There's vessel security procedures on board the ship for other things other than piracy. But at that time, there wasn't. Since then, there have been regulations added to the security plans that now deal with piracy.
You mentioned that the SEALs were on the lifeboat within seconds after
Right.
they were shot at. Did they like swim around in the water?
They were in the water, right. They were in the water.
Why couldn't you hire hired security?
You're getting ahead of me. We'll talk about that. So that's why we've had a presence in the Mediterranean. But getting back to the crew, unfortunately, there's always people that are looking to make a buck. Professionally looking at what Rich Phillips did, I think he did the right thing. He did absolutely what was right. If he makes any money out of it, God bless him. He deserves it. I would not want to change places with him at any time. There's no way I'd want to be in a lifeboat with 3 people I don't want to be in there with. So good luck to him. So piracy, we've been dealing with piracy my whole career. When I first started sailing, we used to deal with piracy in the Malacca Straits is where we had a lot of piracy. Off the coast of Vietnam, off the coast of China. Off of China, they were kind of ruthless. They had beheaded a couple crews. You didn't hear much about it because it was over there. Same thing in Vietnam in the 1980s. After we left Vietnam, Vietnam collapsed. A lot of people were trying to get out. There was a lot of piracy going on with the Vietnamese boat people. The Malacca Straits were famous for piracy. Once you came through Singapore, you came up through here, is where we found a lot of the pirates. It made it very easy for them because there's a large amount of traffic going through that part of the world. It's very shallow water and it's busy. There's not a lot of room in there to navigate ships. And you'll be taking ships passing you, they'll be 100 yards off on either side. So you don't have a lot of wiggle room in there to move a ship. Very easy for a small boat to come alongside and get on board. And generally what they did in the Singapore Straits and in Malacca was they would just come on board and rob you. They wouldn't take the ship as a hostage. They wouldn't take the crew as a hostage. They didn't care about the cargo. They were just looking for quick money and getting out of there and get whatever they could. They would get rope, paint, cash out of the safe, drugs, whatever they could get. They were on board and gone. Usually they used big knives, machete type things. Not too often did they use weapons. Once in a while they would. So it was just like the old days in the stagecoaches. They just rob you and they would go. They weren't taking the ships for hostage. Although they did start doing it later in the years, and there's a very famous story out there that because this was so unknown everywhere that there was a vessel that was actually taken right around here because a lot of the pirates used to come out of Bandarachi. And we saw a big down curve after the tidal wave. The tsunami went through. Piracy really went down. But what happened was this vessel was taken, the crew was put into a lifeboat, and they were told to go west, and that they would find land. Well, when they started sailing west, they realized because of where the sun was and their navigational skills, they were going the wrong way. So they turned around, and they started going back east. After about 10 days at sea, they finally wound up off the coast of Thailand, and they thought they were dying because as they started coming up to the beach, they saw beautiful white beaches, palm trees, and then they saw people on the beach. And then they saw a big table and they saw fruit, and so they thought they were going to heaven. They thought they were actually dying. And they got off the boats and they were crawling on the beaches. And they finally got up to where everybody was, and they had landed on a resort. And all the people came and they helped them and they gave them food and they gave them water and they helped nurture them back, and then they gave them the bill. So that's supposedly a story out there. If it's a sea story or not, I don't know, but that's one that was passed down to me. So, but the Straits were very, very well known for piracy at that time.
And these incidents that you're speaking of, they weren't American.
No. The American merchant fleet is very, very small. When I started in the 70s, we had about 2,000 ships. We're down to about 100 right now that fly the American flag. So our American merchant marine is going away. And that's another thing that I speak about. So that's a bad thing. When we lose our Navy and our military and our merchant marine, we're gone.
On the Hudson River, 30, 40 years ago, there was a huge mothball fleet there. And I was just curious, whatever happened to that? They just cut it up for scrap iron?
Geez, I don't know. On the Hudson River, I don't know what happened to it. Yeah, they've been
Miles of
they've been scrapping a lot of these ships. There's some down in there's some out in Sassoon Bay out in San Francisco. There's some down in Texas, in Norfolk. They're starting to scrap these ships as they start realizing they're never going back to sea. Those are the Ready Reserve Force that were supposed to be ready to go to war. You know, when Vietnam came up, a lot of them were Vietnam era ships, and we pulled some of them out during the Persian Gulf incident. But now they're just getting too far beyond repair, so they're starting to scrap them. So when we talk about the Malacca Straits, these are the type of pirates that we were dealing with. And what's happened in Malacca is because there's so much traffic going through there that the owners started getting tired, so they started putting a lot of pressure on the governments. And now the governments are doing a much better job of patrolling that area during the day and the nighttime, so we don't have as many incidents as we used to. We still do have them, mostly when vessels are at anchor. That's when you're in danger, when you're down off of Singapore. You get into that Indonesia part of the world, you start getting pirates that'll come aboard at nighttime. And again, they'll steal the paint, they'll knock on the captain's door and rob them at gunpoint and take the money, and they'll be gone. They don't want anything to do with the ship, they don't want anything to do with the crew. But when we talk about piracy today, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about young guys running around in a 16-foot boat with RPGs and AK-47s. You can see one of the vessels that they have off the coast that's been pirated just sitting out there waiting, and that's what they've been doing. When they go out, they capture a vessel, they bring the vessel back, and they hold the crew hostage. What they don't have the resources for is to move the cargo. You know, if they had the resources to move that cargo, then they'd really be wealthy, because that's really where the money is. When you start talking about crews and what they're worth, it depends on what nationality. You know, if we're talking about an American crew, you know, a wrongful death maybe between 1.3 to maybe $2 million. But when we start talking about a Filipino or an Indonesian or somebody from a third or fourth world country, we're talking maybe $5,000. So it really, the money isn't there, so you don't have a lot of incentive for a lot of these companies, and not specifically American companies, but third world operators. There's not a lot of incentive to really bargain to get their crews back for real quickly. So the crews sit out there and suffer.
I have read that a lot of merchant ships carry piracy insurance with Lloyd's.
They do.
Could you tell us how that works?
Yeah, what it basically is, it's a ransom type insurance that they'll carry in case they're ransomed, that there's money sitting there, so it doesn't have to come out of the company's pockets. Not all companies were doing that, so initially they were having to pay, and I'll talk about that a little bit more with one of the situations I was involved in. So this is what we're looking, go ahead.
What is the cargo?
It could depend on anything. A lot of these ships are carrying oil. They've had a couple tankers that were taking these, what they call a VLCC, very large crew carriers that are humongous ships that are just filled with black oil coming out of the Persian Gulf. They've had some that are just filled with iron, some with ore, some with grain. It all depends on the cargo. They've had a couple roll-on, roll-off ships that had military equipment in them. They had a couple that had tanks, and they had some that had nothing but, there was a Russian ship that was taken that had AK-47s and RPGs. So it all depends on the cargo. If they can use it, they'll take it. Something small like the AKs and stuff, they steal. But other than, you know, they don't have the resources to move all that oil.
They
You
don't
know,
know ahead of time anyway.
That's debatable. It depends. It depends on what pirate group. We're talking about, when we talk about pirates, we're talking about a different caliber levels of pirates too. We're talking about some that are very well informed and some that aren't. But generally, that's the face of piracy today in Somalia. It's generally a young man, about 16 years old, uneducated, and he's held an AK-47 since he's probably been about 5 years old.
The Somalis will tell you that if we didn't pollute our waters off the coast with oil and junk and everything else, they could still be fishing. So they had to turn to it.
That's true.
And then it got flopped.
What happened was because, and you have to go back a little bit further, because prior to Black Hawk Down and the whole 9 yards, you know, and the thing about Somalia is it used to be a sovereign nation at one time with their own language. And they've been split up quite a bit now because they got back to being tribal. And they've gone a lot, a lot of them gone back into the Muslim culture, and you have Christians, and you're having the same problems there that you do in most of the Middle East. So the country got really fractured, and that's when you started having these warlords step up. And that's when we had all the problems in Somalia with the food aid, and we put the military in there. And so that's when the problems really started, was the collapse of their government. Because once their government collapsed, they had no way to protect their waterways. And so what happened is, they no longer had a coast guard or anybody, and you started seeing foreign countries starting to come in and fish their waters. And that was absolutely happening. Whether they were dropping radioactive toxicity into that part of the world, I don't know. I couldn't tell you, but I've heard that they did. There were countries that used to come and just dump all the toxic waste in that part of the world. Why you'd want to do that and fish it at the same time, I don't understand, but that's what was happening. The fishing absolutely was happening, and that's how the piracy started, was that they would go out there and they would get payment from these guys because they were taking their fish. And then they started holding them hostage. And then what happened from there was that the Spanish and a couple other people started putting armed teams on board their fishing boats to protect the fishermen while they were stealing the fish from Somalia. So the Somalis started getting into the armed conflict. And so it just started escalating. And that's what happened. And from there they started going after ships because they felt the ships should have to pay a toll as they went by. So they just escalated and escalated and escalated. You know, the ransoms were as low as $50,000 for a crew at one time. I worked on a case with on a ship that it was $10 million was the ransom paid. So it's just not, you can't finger one problem over there. It's a multitude of different factors that have caused the problem in Somalia. But the main one is the breakdown of the government.
Where do they get their ammunition?
Black market. It's very easy. There's so much ammunition in that part of the world. It's unbelievable. You know, it's just, you know, when you have money, you can buy anything. So, you know, going to sea is a dangerous profession. As mariners, we all know that. You know, it's a dangerous profession to be out there. You know, as mariners, the things that we train for and we have to prepare for are things like fire. No, we don't have a fire department. I can't call the Lexington Fire Department to come put out my fire. We have to deal with that ourselves. So that's some of the things that we train in. Collisions, they happen every day out there. Happens all the time. The problem being is that I know that where I've been trained, I was trained in an official school, at a maritime academy, but I don't know where the guy sailing next to me has been trained. So we don't have an equivalency of training out there, and this is a big problem. Groundings, they happen all the time, and they happen to everybody. They happen to the Coast Guard, they happen to the Navy, and they happen commercially. It happens. These are problems that we have, and we have risk assessments to see why and investigations. But it's another thing that we, as a mariner, have to be aware of when we go to sea, that it's a possibility of something like this happening. Sinkings are always another problem that we have to worry about. Ships breaking up in bad weather or because the cargo shifted or some other problem that we have to deal with. Flooding and capsizing, another problem. Especially when ships come out of shipyard and they've redone the valves and the pumps, that some of the shipyard workers may have put valves in backwards. So when you go to open up a valve, it doesn't open and the wrong one does, and all of a sudden the ship starts laying over a certain reason or a certain wide. You need to figure out what's happened, and you realize that the guy they were paying $2 an hour put the valves in backwards.
Yes, when they investigate one of these incidents of flooding, capsizing,
Right.
whatever, is the blame assessed to the captain at all?
Oh, always. Blame's always on the captain.
So is he drummed out of the service?
Not drummed out, looking at going to prison. And a lot of incidents. What we've had in the merchant marine is the criminalization of the captains. Is that the captains are being criminalized for a lot of decisions, just decisions that they make. So you're seeing a lot of guys like myself are backing away and saying, that's it, I'm done. You know, I'm not going to jail because the cook threw over a gallon of oil in the water. You know, they're now taking the captains off to jail, and it's a very hefty fine. As these ships get bigger and bigger, we're having more problems with cargo, because what we have to rely on is that the person who loaded that container did it right, that they put all the heavy stuff on the bottom rather than on the top. So you would think what is common sense may be, but when you're taking containers out of India or someplace or Pakistan, that, you know, you can't rely on common sense out there. You just don't know. And as mariners, we don't know what's in those boxes. All we know is we're given a number and a weight, and that's it. But we don't know if that box has been properly loaded. We only hope that it has. The average container ship is about, right now, runs between 5,000 to 7,000 containers, what they call TEUs.
And you don't know what's in them?
No, no.
As
This-
a captain, you don't know what's on your ship?
No. There's 7,000 containers on there. You have no idea what's in
And you
every
don't
one of
have a
those.
list of them.
All you have is a list with numbers
Oh.
and locations, and that's all you do. Because the industry's gotten so big and so technical that it's no longer that you can go down. When I started with the cranes and the booms, we used to see, okay, here comes 6 bales of sugar. Boom, boom, put that there. Here comes 3 vehicles. And I used to load ships like that. It's no longer done like that. Ships are now loaded from the shoreside people on computers.
And the terrorists who really have a good time.
And hopefully they have a maritime background. So we're finding that this happens a lot more and more frequently. Not only with that, but the compatibility of cargoes. Because when you're carrying a hazmat cargo, you can only put stuff close to each other. You can't put a certain explosive next to another certain explosive. It has to be a certain distance away and a certain distance above. A lot of these people loading the ships don't have that kind of knowledge. They rely on the computer program to do that. So we're finding lots of problems like that. And like I said, the average ship was, right now, the average container ship's about 5,000 to 7,000 containers. They just launched one the other day. She carries 18,000 containers right now. So it's just the industry's getting bigger and they're getting less and less people on board the ships.
Would that have a double hull versus a single hull?
No,
Only the
because it's
tankers-
not a tanker.
Only the tankers do that?
That's right. And when you talk about double hull and single hull, the thing about it is that, you know, all ships carry fuel. You know, and this ship carries black oil. It just doesn't carry as much, but its fuel tanks are usually on the outboard side of the vessel. So, you know, he can be carrying as much as 200 metric tons of fuel in a tank. And that's a lot of fuel that if he hits a rock or something's going into the ocean. So, you know, this double hull thing's kind of, you know, for tankers, they only did it for one class of ship. And of course, as mariners, we always got to deal with weather. I mean, those are the things, these are the general things that, you know, when I signed on board a ship that I knew could possibly happen to me. This is what I was prepared for. This are the things that I trained for. But now, since the coal, as mariners, we now have entered into a whole new realm of things, maritime terrorism. And because of, in piracy, because of 9/11, we've gone into vessel security plans to where now we actually have to have a vessel security officer, we have to have training, and we actually have to have a vessel security plan as to what we do in certain incidents and procedures on protecting the vessel and keeping it secure. It's mostly a regulatory type class. It's not anything that's going to make anybody tactical, but it is regulatory, so you know what you're supposed to do as far as checklists and what you do in a bomb incident and things like that. And it wasn't until April of 2009, in 5 days, we were all reintroduced to piracy, is when people started learning about piracy. And the Alabama's been attacked several times, not just once. After the Alabama, Maersk did put on security teams. When I started speaking in 2009, and I can remember speaking in the Middle East, in Bahrain I was speaking, and I was talking about how we had to stop piracy right now was we needed to put security teams on board the ships. And I could tell you that 95% of that audience looked at me and they were shaking their heads. And I was actually called an American cowboy. So, and that's why I went out and bought the boots. So,
Good for you.
but I was being called an American cowboy.
Isn't it part of the industry's problem in general prior to 2009? Is they were awarding these $1 million bounties. I mean,
Correct.
Dropping them, the other term, out on the chopper, dropping them on board.
That's
for
correct.
Millions of dollars, so there was these kingpins
That's right.
that were there.
They were feeding the problem. And actually, when we talk about the Alabama, Maersk wanted to pay the ransom. They absolutely wanted to pay the ransom. They said they were going to pay the ransom, and there wasn't anything the government was going to do until the government said, you pay the ransom, we're taking you to jail, because we don't deal with terrorists. And we don't deal with pirates. And they just don't pay people like that. So Maersk didn't pay the ransom, and they haven't. And there hasn't been one American ship that's ever paid a ransom, and you won't see that happen. So we don't pay ransoms. But what had happened was, I had been out there professing that we need to start putting security teams on board, and I had laid out how we need to do it. Well, people started putting security teams on board, and security teams started to open up and flourish. And the problem is there's actually no regulations, there's no vetting on what's being put out there right now. And those guys that are, some of those guys out there, it is the wild, wild west. So one of the things I'm trying to lasso and wrangle right now is to get training and to get vetting and to get training for these guys, and vetting, so we know who we're putting on these ships. Some of the problems is that some of these guys come from a different mentality than what we really need out there, because this is actually, when we look at it in a legal standpoint, this is a policing action. This is not a combat situation, so you can't be putting Navy SEALs on commercial ships to be an aggressor. You really need to step back, and I'll talk about that a little bit down the road. But prior to Richie Phillips, there were many ships being taken hostage out there. Captain Pacheco is a friend of mine. I've worked with Captain Pacheco. I know him pretty well. We talk quite a bit still. He was held for 162 days. And he was taken, as you can see, in 2008. And the Alabama wasn't taken until 2009. And he had been held hostage. A third world flag country ship, he wasn't getting any help from anybody. He was held 162 days until he was finally released. When he was released, he was told if he went outside, there'd be a ship out there waiting to give him fuel. They were never there. He ran out of fuel again. He was worried about getting taken hostage. It wasn't until he started making phone calls to CNN and Fox. It was actually Fox News Network that got it on the air and actually got this guy help, to where an American frigate came and actually gave him fuel so he could get the ship to Salalah. But when he was on board the ship, the pirates, there was quite a few pirates, and he had told me that one of the pirates spoke great English, and he was the one he was communicating from. And when he asked him, how do you speak such good English, the pirate said he was from Ohio. So, when I sat with NCIS, they were very, very interested in that. And there's a big Somali, population up towards in the Ohio district. So they were interested in knowing that. But he was from Ohio. But he was the negotiator that they were using. And the pirates, he was asked to put on the bridge wings, out on the bridge wings here, when you're going through the heat in the hot deserts, you have canopies that you put over so you don't burn. He was asked by the pirates if they could put those canopies up. And he said absolutely. So himself and the chief mate went to one side, and they were putting the canopies up, and the pirates went to the other side. It's about 4 pirates when he heard gunfire. And he looked over, and 3 of the pirates were dead, and 1 was standing there. And so he got kind of, shook up, and he wanted to find out what was happening. And what happened was one of the pirates was upset that the 3 pirates had gotten a little bit more money than he did from the crew, so he shot them all. So there is no brotherhood of pirates at all out there. So he knew he was in a very dangerous situation. They would lay him down on the deck and take shots at him. It was horrific what was done to this crew. And as you can see, this picture was on their release. This is what Captain Pacheco saw coming alongside him. And this is a typical pirate-type boat that you see. There'll be a bunch of Somalis in there. He's got the RPG. They've got the famous ladder that they use. They come alongside, they throw that ladder up, and they're up there like that. They're on board. So when he looked over his side, that's what he saw. And this was the picture he was taking as they were coming aboard. There was absolutely nothing he could do. Now, the MV Ariana is an interesting story. As I said, I speak worldwide, and I was actually speaking over in, it was either Europe or the Middle East, I forget at the time, but I was giving a presentation very similar to this, talking about armed security guards. And during the break, when we all went out and had our coffee and a little networking, I had an officer come up to me, a Ukrainian officer, and he was a colonel. And he said he needed to speak to me. And so I went and talked to him, and he said he was very interested in talking to me, and he had it from the highest authorities of the Ukrainian government, from Yushchenko himself, to talk to me. And he wanted to talk about the Ariana. Now, the Ariana was a vessel that was taken in 2009. And as you can see, she was held for till December, almost 6 months, 7 months she was held. This was a ship that was crewed by Ukrainians, all Ukrainian crew. But it was a ship that was owned by a Greek, was flagged in Cyprus, and crewed by Ukrainians. So we had 3 different nationalities involved here. And the problem was that the pirates were dealing with the Greek owner, and the Greek owner was playing games. You know, the pirates would ask for $1 million, he'd offer 100,000. And so this was going on and on and on and on and on. Well, in the Ukrainian merchant marine, what they do there is a lot of the guys sail with their families. They bring their children, they bring their wives, and it's a very family-orientated type business, in a lot of different companies. Not so in the American merchant marine. It's just mostly all men or women that specifically go into the business. But the second engineer had brought his wife along, and at the beginning of the voyage, they had conceived, and she became pregnant. About the 5th or 6th month into her pregnancy, while they were being held hostage. Now you got to realize that the ship sitting on the beach this long had run out of fuel. There was no more fuel in the ship, so they couldn't run the lights, they couldn't run the electricity, they couldn't make fresh water, they couldn't run the toilets. There was nothing. There was the freezer, everything in the freezer was ruined. This was what we call a dead ship. She was dead. She would be dark at night. So it was a very, very hostile environment. Plus it's 125 to 130 degrees over there, and when you're on a ship, you just bake. So it's miserable. Well, command structure had broken down so bad on the ship that the woman received a beating from one of the crew members, actually, that she had a miscarriage on board after being pregnant for 6 months. And so they had to put the fetus into the hot, well, I call it a hot box rather than a chill box. And she was having all sorts of problems. So the captain had let the owner know the situation, and the Somalis were actually saying, let's get there was 2 women on board, let's take the women off. The Greek captain said no. He wanted to keep them on because he felt they were a better bargaining chip, as did the owner, to try to get the negotiation price down. So when I spoke about this for a long time. Well, I was appalled, and I used to say that, what we need to do is we need to take criminal action against the captain and the owner because they didn't do the right thing. And the right thing is to keep your crew safe at all times. And if they could get anybody off of that ship, and from a hostage situation, that's what you do. If you can get somebody out there, it doesn't matter if it's 1, 2, or 3 people, you get them off and get them away from it, so it makes it easier for the responding team to come in and deal with the problem. The captain wasn't doing it. He was holding them as a piece. So I wanted to push forward litigation through the UN to get these guys to get prison raps, that they should go to prison. So as I was talking, he came up and said that they needed some help. So I sat and talked to him. I said, well, I'm a ship driver. What can I do? And he says, no, Captain, we know who you deal with. And one of my partners that I started up my company with was a Navy SEAL, Jack Lynch. Jack was 32 years in the teams. He was the president of the SEAL Association. And they knew that a lot of my people that I work with are ex-Navy SEALs. One of them is actually one of the founding plank owners of Dev Group, SEAL Team 6, Jimmy Papineau. And so I said, well, let me see what I can do. I came back home, and we all met, sat down, and I told them what they wanted to do, that they wanted to have any kind of pictures or any communications from the crew if we could do that. And I said we could do that. So I got back to them and said we could supply pictures and let you know what was going on with the crew. From there, it started to develop a little bit further to where a rescue plan was actually developed to where we were going to go in, and we had a plan that would get this ship out of there and get the crew safe. 7 days after we got involved with this whole thing, the ship was released. And I think what had happened was the Ukrainians had let the Greek know that Americans were now involved and something was going to happen, that they weren't going to stand back anymore. So the crew was eventually released, and they were sent back. And I stayed in touch with this Ukrainian for quite a while. But the problem here is that people don't hear these stories about what was happening with these Somali pirates and what was happening with the crews. And the big problem was just not the pirates, it was the owners too. That they weren't respecting the crew's rights to set them free. And I understand about negotiation too, but when you're holding a crew for 223 days, I think we're getting past the negotiation points here. And then I got involved with another ship called the MV Blida, which was also Ukrainians on board. And the Ukrainians again contacted me to see if we could help them, because what had happened was the Somalis knew something was up and they had taken the crew off. And so with another person that I work with, who was another plank owner of Delta Team, we went in, and he, through his contacts, because he was the UN security advisor in Somalia for 10 years, we actually put a team inside Somalia and they went up and we found where the crew was. Again, 10 days later, that crew was released.
Where would that ship be held when it was going on?
Depends where, usually on Kisimu or right off the beach in Somalia. There's a couple different places that they have, that they would just anchor them right out, and that would be it. The Sam Ho Dream is another side of the equation of the problem that we have out there. This is one of VLCC, one of the largest ships that was ever held hostage. As you can see, it was a $9.5 million ransom paid. I was involved with this through Holland and Knight, who's a law firm in New York, and they asked me to represent the captain. What had happened is that Sam Ho, who owned the vessel, chartered the vessel out to an oil company, and the oil company was now suing the shipping company, saying that the captain had deliberately taken the vessel into a pirate's hornet's nest, and that the captain wanted to be taken by pirates. This couldn't be furthermore from the truth than anything I've ever seen. But the big problem is that, I tell people that even though this captain was held for 216 days, once he was released, he now had to get persecuted in the court systems, saying that he actually tried to deliberately take this vessel and be taken hostage. As they've said things about Richie Phillips, the same thing, saying he deliberately got caught. I don't know any captains that I've ever dealt with that deliberately tried to get caught by pirates. It's not a friendly environment. So I was dealing with that to the point where Sam Ho ended up having to pay the ransom. They since have gone out of business. They lost 17 ships that are now laid up, they're not working, because they had to pay that ransom. It also happens in the private industry. We've had quite a few sailing vessels that have been taken as Transocean sailors sail that part of the world. There was a very famous French one that was taken, and the French tried to actually rescue this right after the Phillips incident. They went in and tried to rescue the family, and the father was actually killed. This fella here was actually shot and killed on the rescue attempt. So that was kind of a failure on the French's part. They didn't get everybody out of there, but they got the rest of the family out, and they did get the family out of there.
Who were the rescuers?
They're French commandos.
French community.
Yeah.
The pirates were on the boat.
They are no longer with us. Then we have the famous case of the Chandlers, who were held for a long, long time. And the problem was that the British government wouldn't negotiate. The pirates wanted a big ransom. Again, the British don't pay ransom, so we have this problem as to how do you get these people out of here. The British aren't willing to go in because these people were deep inside Somalia. They weren't on their boat. They were being held up into the desert. Eventually, $1 million ransom was paid and they were released. Then, of course, we have the sailing vessel Quest. I don't know if anybody's familiar with that, but that's 4 Americans that were on board sailing out there. These people were going around doing God's work, passing out Bibles in that part of the world. They were taken by these pirates. They didn't understand the mentality of what they had on board. The problem is there was a lot of pirates on board this ship. I think there was like 6 or 8 of them that were on at the time. A lot of them come from different tribes, so they don't get along too well anyways. And when you introduce cot, you've got a high-level situation. They brought out an FBI negotiator, and he was on the military ship that was trying to negotiate with the pirates. It became a problem. The pirates started shooting at the military ships. Next thing we know, a gun battle ensued. They killed all the Americans. The pirates killed all the Americans. Navy SEALs got on board the vessel, and they killed all the pirates, except for one, the one they held as a negotiator. I got involved with this. I work with the U.S. attorneys quite a bit on quite a few piracy cases. I was involved with this one on getting the boat back home because it was evidentiary. It was evidence that they needed to get back. So I helped the U.S. attorneys arrange to put the sailboat on a Maersk vessel and bring it home. And as you can see, the interesting thing about this picture is that's the Alabama right behind her. So when we talk about coincidences, it's just unbelievable. And at the time, when I looked at the picture, I didn't realize it when my guy sent me the picture of it being loaded on, that the Alabama was sitting right there behind her. So it's quite a coincidence. So not only do we have problems with piracy in the merchant world, in the private world, the military also has private problems with piracy. And when you say, are they afraid of the American flag, they're not. These pirates attacked, I worked with the U.S. attorneys on this case. They attacked the USS Ashland, and they also attacked the NS Nichols. Early morning attack, pirates attacked these vessels, and as you can see, we don't negotiate with pirates. And some of the pirates were killed. When the pirates opened up on the military ships, the militaries opened back. There were 7 pirates. 5.5 came back. And you can see the pirates are right down here as they were loading them. And that's what was left of the pirate boat. And you can see the famous ladder. And what they used to carry is a 55-gallon drum that they used to carry extra fuel in. So, in some of these, you can see some of the AK-47s. But no, we didn't pay any ransom for that. The interesting thing is that when it came back into the court systems, the Ashland was being looked at by one judge and the Nichols was being looked at by another judge. One judge said, absolutely, this is a case of piracy. The other judge said, absolutely, this is not a case of piracy. So we started getting into the legal definitions of what is piracy. And what's on the rules, it goes way back to the 1800s. So they're kind of looking at that right now and seeing how they can change it legally to prosecute these guys. The problem that they're running into is that if they don't go to jail for life, what they're looking at in some countries, there's only a minimum or a mandatory amount of time they can sentence somebody, that when these Somalis come out of prison, say in the Netherlands or something, they're going to want to become citizens. And that's one of the big problems that a lot of the countries are looking at, that they don't want to start seeing a mass evacuation of Somalia because they want to become citizens. And legally, you know, you'd think this would be a very easy solution. I spoke in Oberammergau, Germany, which is where NATO has its school, and I was the lead-off speaker there. And the second day was generated just towards the lawyers, and these were lawyers from all over the world. And when I saw the lawyers speaking and arguing, I said to myself, this is a big problem, because none of the lawyers agreed with each other, and it was a mess.
And that was part of the problem with us being looked at as lame ducks, pretty much, because of the jurisdictional problems. And I think prior to this, wasn't it not the Indian Navy that took forefront efforts to protect some of these ships, even to bring back the crew?
Yes, the Indian Navy was out there doing it, but the Indian Navy had some problems too. They actually had some pirates on a Thai fishing vessel, and they destroyed the whole boat and killed the crew. So the Indian Navy was trying to do something right, but they did it in the wrong way. What we're looking at here is the AIS. Go ahead.
It's the first time I've heard that SEALs were involved in the anti-piracy activity. Is that a
Yeah.
thing? Because the SEALs have lots of them. What goes on?
In certain cases, the SEALs have only been involved in the hostage situations, where someone's been a hostage, is when we get involved. As we just saw, we lost a Navy SEAL the other day. I don't know if anybody knows that, but he went in to rescue an American doctor. You know, that was SEAL Team 6 went in there. So the SEALs go in, and that's their kind of stuff that they do. They're an aggressive force. They'll go in there and they don't take any names. They just go in and do what they got to do and get out. And they do the same thing with a hostage situation. If there's an American in trouble, it's probably going to be especially if it's around the water, it's going to be the SEALs. You know, if it's in an airport or something, it may be Delta Team guys. But if there's an American hostage, there's probably help coming somewhere. And we had the same situation. There was a young female that was working over there. I think it was Countries Have No Borders or something, and she was working on looking for mines and stuff, that Princess Diana organization. And she was taken hostage by Somali pirates. And the Navy SEALs out of Djibouti went and rescued her. So they do quite a bit of that stuff. What we're looking at here is we can see the traffic in this part of the world. What we have right here, this is Somalia, which is known as the Horn of Africa. Here we have the nice peaceful country of Yemen. And then you have Eritrea up here, Egypt, and then we have Saudi Arabia over here. So it's a very hostile part of the world to be transiting in. But the Somali pirates were originally attacking in this area here called the Gulf of Aden. And that's where they would come. And you were told to stay at least 50 miles off the coast of Somalia. So you'd have to stay off this coast. Now, Richie Phillips was coming out of here from Djibouti and coming around to here. Well, there's really no way of getting there except for coming around the Horn of Africa. and he was 150 miles out when we were supposed to be 50 miles out. So he was more than 100 miles away he should have been. But this is like in 2010, this is way after Phillips. You can see where the traffic was. And most of it's right here is through what they call a traffic scheme. This was protected by the military. And the military would run a convoy up and down and you'd run with them. So there'd be military ships up in there. Yet the pirates were still hitting ships every now and then, but it was diminished quite a bit. But when that happened, the pirates started spreading out. And you saw the ships as they were going down to Singapore in the Far East, they would come out to here and then they would shoot down. Ships coming out of the Persian Gulf would run all the way down here and then run up in Mogadishu or Mombasa. Rather than you would have come down here and come down in like that. That saves a lot of time and a lot of fuel. And when you're talking about, a barrel of oil being what it is, that's a lot of money to the owner. So he wants you to get there as fast as you can and as quick as you can and as economical as you can. So they started running ships down here, and what they started doing was slowing the ships down, running at economical fuel speeds. But when you did that, you started making the ship a much easier target for pirates to board. But as you can see in 2010, that's where all the traffic was, and that's what that's showing you is the shipping traffic. 2011, you can see how it's even changed even more. That, before everybody was coming down at 165, which was there. And that's where that super tanker was taken right about here at 165. That's in the middle of the Indian Ocean. Now, and when I got involved in that, they were telling the company that the captain should have been way over here and gone like that. Well, in 2011 they were, but in 2010 they weren't. And now you can see all the ship traffic is coming down this way and running around to go around the tip of South Africa. So you can see how much space and water the Somali pirates control. And with the military out there, we have CTF-151. It's equivalent to one police car protecting from the East Coast all the way out to Ohio. So if you can imagine that area, it's a very, very large open area to be watching for pirates. We talk about piracy. These are all incidents of piracy in the area. You can see they're off the coast of India, they're up in the Persian Gulf, and they're down off of Africa. Globally, we can see what piracy is. Piracy is worldwide. It just is not in Somalia. So until we stabilize Somalia and they get a working government, the only way we're going to stop piracy right now is at the ship's reels. That's it. We're going to keep them from getting on board the ships. And there's lots of ways you can do that. Some of the ways are passive ways and some of the ways are aggressive ways. The security teams are aggressive. What Bill was talking about is called an LRAD. And that's a long-range acoustical device. And it's looks like a big cylinder that they send an acoustical wave that can actually damage your eardrums. The problem with that is you need to be out in the open moving it while they're shooting at you. So it's passive. There's a lot of different things out there that are passive. The dazzler is another thing, which is like a laser light that can be shined and blind, and it can actually blind you for a little bit. So there's things that can be done passively. But the problem with passive stuff is it's usually very, very expensive. And these shipping companies, like everybody else right now, are looking at economical times and they're trying to save money. One of the things that was happening out there, and the problem that I've had is that, again, I see people that are getting into the business and making statements, and they really shouldn't be. I actually got into a little confrontation with a Navy admiral who thought that this was a great idea to have the crew making Molotov cocktails to throw at the pirates. But from my standpoint, it's not a good idea to have your crew, number one, drinking beer with cotton gloves, throwing Molotov cocktails. We're looking at a potential problem here. And it's not a good idea, but he thinks it's a great idea. And the reason he thinks it's a great idea is because most of the pirates have got bare feet, and they don't want to step on the glass when it breaks on the deck. So he's looking at it from that part of it, but I'm looking at it from a fire aspect, because I've got a better chance of having a fire on that ship than I do from a pirate getting me. So there's a lot of people out there that are saying things that really shouldn't be saying things. And I've seen pictures up here where they've got concertina wire all over the ship, and it's a nightmare for anybody that goes to sea. One of the things that we do is we do train. as I said, I was out there saying that we should have security teams on board the ships. A lot of the companies right now are putting security teams. The problem is we don't have the same type of quality security teams. I was actually putting security teams on board ships for a while, but the problem was that it got so competitive and the price came down too much that we couldn't do it to where we felt safe and comfortable doing it. When I put a 5-man team on board a ship, they went with $100,000 worth of equipment. Right now, though, we got security teams out there that have maybe one rifle and a couple pistols, and that's it. It's totally inadequate, and they're down to 3 men. This is totally inadequate. It's not right. They're putting these guys' lives in jeopardy. And the price has come down from, when we were putting the team, it was about $7,000 a day for 5 guys. It's down to about $2,500 a day right now. So what's happened is it's opened the market up for a lot of guys to get into the business that should have no business being out there. The reason I say that is because this is a legal nightmare too, a big legal nightmare. But what we were doing is we would also train the crew in familiarization of firearms. So they were familiar in case anybody got hurt in one of the teams. And when I sent the teams out there, all 5 were shooters, but one of them was a full-born Army medic who's probably as good as any qualified emergency room surgeon. One was a communications officer. So we had all our links, communication links and hospital stuff. We would train the crew so they would be familiar with the weapon, so in case anything happened that they would not be without understanding how to use a weapon. This was an incident I had my very last trip. I had a couple pirates try to board my ship, and the only thing that kept them off was I had a 9mm high-powered Browning that I was able to fire at to keep them away.
Were they firing at you?
Not at that time. This is on the ship that I'm on right now. I'm on a USNS ship. It's a Navy ship. When you go on the gray side and you're on a gray, they have a totally different mentality. There we have a full arms locker. We are trained in weapons. We get qualified every year. I'm trained in the grenade launcher, the M14, shotguns, and the Berettas. So we train the whole crew in weapons, so everybody is trained. And we run through drills and scenarios. This was a drill that we did last year. That was a nationwide drill with the United States Navy. One of the things that we're doing now also is we're putting protective armed security teams on board. Again, the problem we're having here is the qualifications. A lot of these guys are qualified, but some of them haven't been trained in weapons in 10 years. So you may have a Navy SEAL out there, but he hasn't really been around weapons for 10 years. He needs to go through a rebriefing, a retraining, so he understands the type of encounters that he may have. And legally, he understands what he may get into when he fires that weapon and takes somebody's life, because it may be an innocent fisherman, and now he's looking at murder charges. One of the other things that we did with Blackwater was Blackwater got into it, and they had gone out and bought a vessel, and they had set this thing up totally right the way it should be done. The only problem is that the vessel was too slow. They got the wrong type of ship for what they needed. It's a great idea. It takes a lot of liability off the owner, but it's quite expensive to run an operation like this.
How about a PT boat?
Well, let's talk about that. Again, the armed escort vessels. There's a couple companies out there right now that want to get into that, but the problem is the logistics of it all. You've got such a large area of transit, and now you need a lot of boats, a lot of crew, a lot of spare parts. It gets so expensive, and if that boat breaks down, you got problems. So there are lots of problems. Blackwater set this up just like a SEAL team operation. They had a helicopter, they had 2 fast ribs on board, they had a lot of good things. Now the interesting thing here is we have a vessel called the Enrique Lexe, which was an Italian ship that had a contingent of Italian Marines on board. So it was a commercial vessel with Italian Marines on board. What happened was they got supposedly attacked by a fishing vessel they thought was a pirate vessel. The Marines opened up, fired, they killed a couple of the crew, and they are now sitting in jail in India on murder charges. So what we're looking at with this problem legally is that Italy says they have sovereignty because they were Marines. They were Italian Marines. It'd be the same as our U.S. Marines on board one of our commercial ships. The government is saying they have sovereignty. They are military people. The The Indians are saying they absolutely do not have sovereignty because they were on a commercial vessel. So this is a legal battle that's now stretching into international boundaries here. As these Marines sit in prison in India waiting to be put on trial for murder, which is coming up in the next month. So what we're seeing now, and it's actually happening, and I talked about this a year ago, that what we're going to see with commercial ships that have teams on board, you're going to start to see the reporting go down. Masters, captains are not going to start reporting the incidents anymore, especially if they team on board, for the fear of prosecution. Because they don't want to have someone say, my brother was a fisherman, you killed him, we're suing you, you should be in jail for murder. So what's happening now is you're seeing the reports go down. And it's being, in the industry, it's being reported that piracy incidents are down. And the reporting incidents are, but the piracy incidents are not. They're not just being reported. And that's what's happening right now. The other problem that you might have is that you might have masters that have security teams will not release the weapons to the security team. And if they get boarded, now you got another problem, because I can guarantee you, if the pirates get on board, that security team is going to do what it has to do to stay alive, because they are not going to be taken hostage.
Going back to even a scene with the pirates without any shoes, look at the enormous firepower they have, and that was a joke, or 9mm versus a grenade launcher
Right.
they have. So,
Right. But when you've got somebody that's elevated you at 150 feet, he don't have the high ground. He don't want to be shot at, so they leave real quick. And that's what's happening with most of them. Is if the pirates are getting any type of challenging fire, they leave. They don't come aboard. But now some companies are being told not to fire any warning shots. So what's happening is you're seeing the pirates have changed their whole tactics once again to where you're not seeing them come alongside with the RPG or the AK-47 anymore. They're coming alongside just as like they were fishermen. So they're being very passive, but what they're doing is they're testing to see if there's a team on board or if anything's going to happen. And then you may become a target. So they're seeing that that's starting to happen now.
Well, they wouldn't necessarily be doing that day like that.
No, usually they do it usually in the morning and in the evening. They want bad visibility. They want when you can't see it. They want the element of surprise. So you don't, but if they've been sitting out there for 4 or 5 days and they see you come along, they're going to come after you. We had this incident happen twice now, and this was on the Global Patriot. The Global Patriot left Iraq 5 days ahead of me, carrying a lot of the armed military stuff that had been damaged in the Iraqi war. We didn't leave anything on the battlefield. We took it all home. I took a lot of it home in my ship, and the Global Patriot took it home on that ship. They put a lot of that ship on the commercial ships because when it comes back to the United States, they didn't want the UPI or any of the AP taking pictures of this stuff on deck. So we used to put it in enclosed ships like mine so nobody knew what was happening, and we would discharge it at military bases so nobody got to see it. She had gone up in Egypt, going through the Suez Canal, and she had a military attachment on board the ship to protect the vessel. What happened was a vendor came alongside, and the military opened up on him, and they killed him. This guy was truly a vendor. He wasn't a terrorist. But the problem is, when you have a military detachment on board a merchant vessel, that their rules of engagement are different than ours, and I don't have a command structure over them. They follow their command structure, which is the military. So if they have rules of engagement, they act on those rules of engagement. We don't even hold the weapons. They hold their own weapons. But the problem is there was poor communications between the captain and the team leader, that the captain never relayed that this was a vendor. Don't shoot him. The guy got within the perimeter. He was shot and killed. We ended up paying a hefty lawsuit out to this family. President Bush had to make an apology at that time. So it does happen. We just had it happen again last year with the Rappahannock. She was another ship off of Bahrain. The Rappahannock had an incident where they had 2 boats coming close. Military detachment opened up, killed a guy, and the chief of police in Bahrain wants to prosecute the military. So what happened was the military staged the vessel somewhere else. She's no longer in the Persian Gulf. They've now moved her to another place. She probably won't go back to Bahrain, but that's what we're starting to see. We're starting to see a lot of litigation now with these shootings. So, you know, piracy is it's a very easy problem to solve from a tactical viewpoint, but when we look at it legally, it's very complicated, very, very complicated. We just can't start opening fire on people that are out there because there are people out there that are fishing.
Some of the police officers, officials that want to prosecute, are they really looking for a payoff?
That could be. I mean, you know, especially in the Middle East. I mean, it happens all the time. That may be what happened. I can't speak on that. I don't know. But that's a very good possibility that something like that could happen. Absolutely. All right. One thing I'd like to show here is that this is all intertwined. You know, if we look at, you know, Qasem Soleimani, I don't know if anybody knows who he is. He's a real bad actor. He's in the Iranian National Forces, but this is the guy that we think put the hit out on the Saudi Arabian ambassador in Washington, D.C. And the State Department hates it when I show this slide. And we know that he's tied in with Hugo Chavez because he goes there quite a bit. And we know Chavez is tied in with the cartels. And we know the cartels are tied in with Hezbollah and Hamas. And they're tied in with Al-Qaeda, who's tied in with Al-Shabaab. And Al-Shabaab's tied in with Somali pirates. So this is like a spider's web. It's all connected somewhere. Go ahead.
Well, thank God anyhow that with Hugo Chavez, he's back in Havana being treated.
Right.
I noticed on your flyers that you had spent time with Delahunt.
Correct.
And I found it unusual. I was in the forum, and Joseph Kennedy happened to come in. This was weeks after George Bush had just come back from a summit, okay, down in the Americas. And that's when Hugo Chavez held up the book, Bush the Devil, and whatnot. He actually got a crowd of 20,000, all worked out. And the Secret Service were afraid for George Bush's life to get him out into safety and so that he could just depart. Delahunt and Joseph Kennedy, Joe for Oil, sat down 2 weeks later at a round table with their yellow clip-hats, and I said to Joseph Kennedy, I says, I respect highly for the price that your family has paid, as with your three uncles. God forbid that George Bush would ever come back in the body bags.
Right.
So we know that the tie sometimes in the inner ring of our congressional leaders and whatnot is kind of sad, the ties that they have.
Well, this is all the politics of it. So I mean, politics is involved in everything. So one of the last slides here is that we know that 70% of the world is covered by water, 80% of the world's population lives near the ocean, and 90% of trade is traveled by water. The latest statistics we have presently 11 ships are being held with 167 hostages. In 2012, 6 seamen were killed and a total of 448 hostages. 125 vessels were boarded, 24 vessels were taken, 26 fired upon. We don't know how many pirates were killed by security teams. We don't know how many fishermen were killed by security teams. And we don't know how many unreported incidents are out there. So that's about it.
Jim, thank you very much. Appreciate it.